Welcome back, and we are here to talk about the finishing technique on the Tansu cabinet. As we talked about before, the technique that we're trying to emulate is actually a Negoro red lacquer finish. So this finishing technique kind of dates back to the medieval period back in Japan. It is a lacquering technique that takes several months because it is a buildup of layers. And since we don't have that luxury of time, what we again wanted to do is try and emulate that process as close as we could. So the steps that we took were, I have a couple different milk paint colors here. I've got a lamp black, which will be my base coat, and then I have this Tuscan red color, which will be the top coat. But there's a few things that happen in between. So what we do is we actually start off with our bare wood here, our ash. And again, we are trying to allow the grain pattern to show through the paint. So, and it inevitably will. So we'll want to be putting this on lighter coats, and as we brush it on, we'll want to apply a couple different coats to get an even coverage. So with that being said, we will go ahead and apply the first coat, which is our black coat of lamp black paint, milk paint. And since it's water-based, it will take a shorter amount of time to dry. And again, since we're using a brush for this technique, they'll go on in thinner layers and they will dry a little bit quicker. So again, you just want to apply with the grain pattern. If you have the luxury of having an HVLP gun, it's always preferred with bigger projects just to get a little bit more of a uniform look. You will have to ultimately water down the milk paint a little bit with warm water just to get the viscosity level you want for it to adequately come out of the gun. But the brush technique works just fine. It's just a little bit slower. However, it's going to yield very similar results. You'll just have to maybe put an extra coat on and maybe a little extra drying time in between. However, but you see that I'm just making strokes here with the grain pattern. You can still see the actual bare wood showing through, as well as some of the actual grain pattern. But we want to ensure that we're putting a nice base coat down. So that's ultimately what a first coat will look like there. Again, you can tell it's very thin. You can still see the lightness of the wood underneath, or the bare wood underneath there, as well as some of the graining. The next step is waiting for it to dry. So I've actually got a couple coats of lamp black paint on there. Again, I just used a 2-inch foam brush to apply that. And then the next step is doing a sealer coat. And the sealer coat is actually protecting the base coat for when we get to the next step, or the third step, which is applying the red paint. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the lacquer, again, acting as our sealer. You don't need to do two. I would just do maybe one liberal coat. All right. Now that you've got that coat applied, I would let that dry. And then we will proceed on to the next step, which is applying our last coat of paint, which we'll inevitably sand through to pull out the underlying color there to achieve that Negoro look we want. But again, we'll let that set for a while and we'll come back to it. So now that we got our sealer coat on the lamp black paint here, we're going to go ahead and move on and apply our top coat, which is the red paint, or the Tuscan red milk paint. So as I alluded to earlier, it's not as important to get full coverage on this. Just do one liberal coat. If you're overly cautious, you can go ahead and proceed and put another coat of lacquer on there, again, just to act as a sealer. But now we're going to go ahead and apply the red paint. And it is actually going to get applied just the same way you applied the black. If you're spraying, you'll go ahead and spray it. If you're using a brush, you'll go ahead and brush it. It is important to know, too, when you're brushing, there probably will be a little less of a dry time in between, so you could probably cut a little bit of your time off by brushing it in terms of waiting when you tend to spray, there's going to be a little bit more of a liberal application. You'll have to wait a little bit longer. Again, I'm going to go ahead and just proceed to brush in the direction of the grain. And realistically, with applying it by brush, you probably will have to put 2, possibly even 3 coats on here just to get your full coverage. Just like so. So we'll go ahead and want to let that dry for, I mean, realistically, I was letting mine dry for a day just so when I go back to sand it, I've got a completely dry surface, because if there's any sort of moisture left over in that paint, it's going to have a tendency to want to gum up that sandpaper. So once you get your full coats on, I've got one prepared here already that has 2 coats of paint on here. I've got the full coverage I'd like. So the next step in the process would be to sand. So you can do this a couple different ways. On a lot of the smaller areas, I actually hand sanded just because they were more delicate areas. On the larger areas on the case, I actually used a palm sander. Now, you want to be cautious with that. You want to use a higher grit sandpaper, and you want to move quickly because, again, it will want to cut down to that base or bare wood. So, again, you might want to try it with like a 320 or 220 if you're using a palm sander on the exterior here. And, again, just make sure you're moving quickly, but also getting the amount of paint showing through that you'd like to kind of make it look contrived. But like I said, you can use hand sandpaper as well. You have a little bit more control. So I'll go ahead and proceed to just rough up the area. You want to just you're just going off feel and how you ultimately want it to look. There's no really right or wrong answer. You just want to get a little bit of the paint to show through to get that sort of Neguro red lacquer effect. So I just have some 180 here. If you find yourself spending a little more time than you like to with that, you can go ahead and cut up to maybe 120 or 100 if you'd like. Again, just whatever you're comfortable with and whatever you have for time. So again, I'm just making motions in the same way that I would with the paint brushes. I'm just working against that grain, kind of going across, ultimately dullling that paint a little bit, which you don't really need to worry about right now because once we put our sealer coat on, it will enhance or enrich that color again and bring some life back to it. So really we're just working back and forth still, trying to find those areas that are wanting to come through. Also, the edges inevitably are the first ones to come through. Again, on the sandpaper, you're going to get some buildup, so you probably will end up going through quite a bit of sandpaper. Okay, I'm finally getting this to a point where I'd like to stop. Again, this is all kind of subjective to how you want it to look, but again, we're just trying to get some of that surface coat to start to show through there and give it kind of that distressed look. I know this is a smaller board, and I suggest that on some of the larger substrates, it might be in your best interest to actually use a palm sander. It is quite time intensive, and the whole idea here is to try and cut down on the amount of time it takes to do these processes. So again, I've got this to about where I want it to be. So now I've got a lot of residual dust and stuff over here. More times than not, I would usually take an air compressor to this, but I do have just a dry cloth and get, again, all that extra kind of dust and buildup that was off of it. But an air compressor would help get the rest of that off. And now that I have that clean surface, we're kind of getting to the end here where we just want to put a couple top coats on. So, and again, I had mentioned before that the color really started to dull up once we started sanding it. Once we actually put our clear coats on there, it will enrich the color that we kind of rid it of in the beginning. So, actually, put my dust mask on. Again, you can put as many coats on here as you want. Typically I do 2, but if you don't think that's sufficient, you can always do 3. I'll go ahead and apply one, usually let it dry for about an hour if I'm using catalyzed lacquer. If you're using a water-based, which you can since these stains are water-based, there's a little bit longer drying time in between those, but catalyzed lacquer, usually about an hour. I start with about a 400, and then I go to a 600 grit, just doing on a couple coats. So again, we'll go ahead and proceed with the lacquer. And you can kind of tell, again, that the richness of the color started to come out once I applied that lacquer, and it'll even do more so as time goes on. The other thing to mention is, too, when I was applying my lacquer coats, I didn't quite leave the total dry time on the red paint, and the purpose of that was it actually causes a crackling effect, which ages it even a little bit more. So it was preferred and actually contrived in this instance where the red paint, or the top coat, was not fully dry when I applied the lacquer. So once the lacquer applied and it began to dry, it actually cracked the undercoat, which again was the preferred look for this particular piece. So in those easy steps, you can accomplish a process that typically takes months and honestly is a lot less toxic too. Milk paint is quite resilient, it's water-based, it's easy to clean up, and you can get several different looks out of it and ultimately accomplish that kind of look of antiquity and elegance you would in the Negoro lacquer finish. So I appreciate you tuning in, and we look forward to seeing some results.